Rural poverty, the Great Depression, militarism, ultranationalism, and other factors led to increasing calls for Japanese imperial expansion. The need for the empire to solve its problems focused initially on Manchuria. Japan was geographically near Manchuria. It had absorbed even closer territories already and had substantial investments along the South Manchurian Railway. Soon, expansion would involve all of China. War in China would lead directly to war in the United States in 1941, provoking the Second World War in the Pacific and Asia. To understand the failure of the League of Nations to respond to Japanese expansionism, it's important to remember its organization and aims. It was organized really so as to serve as a way for member states to kind of fight out their battles within a world parliament versus fighting wars. Now, of course, we know that the League of Nations eventually fails. The problem is first of all, it doesn't have a military. The U.S. doesn't join, many different reasons. But I mean, the main aim was this idea of collective security. And of course, ultimately this fails and the world ends up in yet another war. Japan was heavily invested in Manchuria in the 1920s. Manchuria was over 4 times the size of Japan and had a low population and tremendous amounts of resources that Japan lacked or had in low qualities. Some of these resources were like cotton. They had vast forests and farm products. They had coal, iron, aluminum, magnesium, gold, and lead, among many other things. Manchuria also had its own culture and its own language and was a part of China and therefore had direct access to China's markets and massive population. Japan's military and some of its government saw Manchuria as a solution to many of its problems, for example, as a place to relocate Japan's extremely poor rural farmers. Japan was also increasingly concerned about communism. The Soviet Union shared a long border with Manchuria. Japan's military reasoned that by taking control of Manchuria, they could stop the spread of communism. The border of any potential Soviet-Japanese conflict would be far removed from Japan's home islands if Manchuria was more tightly controlled. Japan was also alarmed that their South Manchurian Railroad, which justified their military presence, was rapidly being undermined. China had begun construction of a rival railroad, and they were starting to operate at full capacity. This would mean decreased revenues for Japan and increased ones for China's government. For these and many other reasons, Japan's Kwantung Army acted insubordinately, just as in 1928. So here is a map of Japanese expansionism, and we see that the earliest date that Japan began to conquer islands, and especially the ones around them, is 1874. And then over here is 1875, even up here to a certain extent. And then it just keeps growing, 1895, 1899, 91 up here. This is the, or excuse me, 91. 1931, that's the one we're talking about now. They took Korea in 1910. So, there was really just a vast amount of movement on Japan's part as I began to think that they were destined to rule over all of Asia. On September 18, 1931, a bomb exploded on the South Manchurian Railway outside the leading city of Manchuria, Mukden. This minor explosion, later known as the Mukden incident, did not even prevent trains from using the railway, but had conveniently taken place near a garrison of Japanese soldiers protecting the railway and operated by Japan. Although many historians believe the Japanese troops, specifically the Kwantung Army officers, placed the bomb, Japan blamed the explosion on the Chinese. The Kuomintang army used the Mukden incident as an excuse to occupy all of Manchuria. They were soon joined by a Japanese army based in Korea, and after all areas along the South Manchurian Railway were under control, they moved west and north. While the more heavily populated areas were occupied in about a week, the rest of Manchuria was progressively occupied over the next couple of months. By February 1932, only a small southern province of Manchuria remained out of Japan's control. Although China had over 100,000 soldiers in the province, and Japan had probably fewer than 25,000, there was relatively little fighting. Japan's army was better trained and better equipped, and the Chinese government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, ordered its troops not to resist the invasion. Almost immediately, Japan created the illusion that they had only helped Manchuria achieve independence from a chaotic China. It was presented to the world as an independent state. The new state of Manchukuo, land of the Manchurians in Japanese, was established and headed by the last emperor of China, a Manchu. He was soon made Emperor of Manchukuo, and he was called the Kangdi Emperor. The Imperial Army of Manchukuo was also created, along with a comprehensive postal system, primary schools, and even a national sports league, which led by, they played baseball and soccer. Japan sponsored Manchukuo in applying for Olympic membership, and Manchukuo applied to become a member of the League of Nations. Both applications were denied, a clear indication that other countries considered Manchukuo's independence a sham, and that the country was really just a puppet state. There were several responses to the Manchurian crisis by world political and economic powers. While most countries responded to Japan's aggression negatively, little could be done to undo the results. This was partly the result of a crushing economic situation with the Great Depression, which prevented any major military actions. Perhaps another reason was that by invading Manchuria, Japan created another border against the communist state of the Soviet Union. Communism was opposed and feared by most governments, as it advocated complete destruction of existing economic, social, and political systems. Many may have thought that Japan had saved Manchuria from a chaotic, corrupt Chinese government. As Japan completely occupied Manchuria, China appealed to the League of Nations. Both China and Japan were League members. The League responded with great caution. This was the first major military conflict between League states. The League eventually formed the Lytton Commission in December 1931 to investigate the Mukden incident and Japan's occupation. Once its report was completed and submitted to the League would then decide what action to take. The Lytton Commission began to operate in late January 1932 when it first visited the Japanese government in Tokyo, finally making it to Manchuria in February. The Lytton Commission's report was finally submitted to the League in October 1932, a full year after the invasion. The report admitted that before Japan invaded, there was an inefficient and corrupt Chinese government in the province, and that Japan had made major financial investments. It also explained the details of the invasion, the establishment of the state of Manchukuo, and the economics of Manchuria, China, and Japan. The report determined that the invasion was not, as Japan insisted, a result of wanting to protect Manchurians from China's government. There was no obvious support for the new state of Manchukuo by the Chinese population of the province. Over 90% of the people in Manchuria were Chinese, not Manchus. It recommended that Japan pull its forces back to the South Manchurian Railway. The League of Nations General Assembly voted on the motion in February 1933 to condemn Japan as an aggressor nation. 42 nations voted against Japan, while Japan voted the sole vote for itself. Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in March 1933, suffering no consequences as a result of its departure. Chiang Kai-shek was forced to resign as premier of China's government in December 1931 by various political groups, including much of his own. This was done for several reasons, but primarily so that a united government composed of various groups could be formed to respond to the crisis. Chiang remained head of the military, however, and Wang Yang-wei became premier. Chiang would be named premier again in 1935, replacing Wang by becoming head of the government again. The lack of resistance by Chiang Kai-shek's army certainly helped Japan achieve rapid victory with minimal losses of soldiers or weapons. Chiang naturally wished to retain Manchuria as part of China, as it was the richest region in terms of resources and industry, although he did realize that Japan's military was stronger and likely to win in a direct battle. Additionally, Chiang may have been more concerned with challenges to his own rule in the rest of China. Japan's armies continued the conquest of outlying areas. Jihol was finally conquered in March 1933, and soon Japanese armies had moved into northern China outside of Manchukuo. On 31st of May 1933, China's government signed the Tangu Truce, essentially recognizing that Jihol and Manchuria were now under Japan's control, promising not to fight to remove Japan from these areas. This agreement also established a neutral zone between Japanese-controlled territory and that of China's government, although this would be violated repeatedly by Japan as it continued to enlarge territory under its control. Chiang's attempts to destroy the Chinese Communist Party had certainly reduced its strength, but by the early 1930s, the CCP was again gaining power, and the nationalists continued to battle its forces. Chiang saw communism as a greater threat than Japan and a more beatable enemy, proving Japan's argument that by conquering Manchuria, it was bringing stability to areas that had only known civil war for years. Chiang spent the majority of 1933 fighting a warlord in northern China for control of the region, who advocated fighting Japan. Chiang finally defeated him. The USA was not part of the League of Nations and was in a period of semi-isolation. This was partly the result of a US public that did not wish to become entangled in international machinations such as those that had led to the First World War. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, it seemed to many in the US that Britain and France, as well as Japan, had enriched themselves by gaining more colonies in the form of mandates. Most believed at the time that imperialism and territorial competition among European states had been one of the main causes of the First World War. There was also a large anti-war movement and a complete lack of political desire to increase taxation to pay for large numbers of ships and troops. The U.S. had always enforced an open-door policy with regard to China. With Japan's invasion of Manchuria, there was fear, rightly, that the open-door policy would be disrupted. The USA was primarily concerned with the economics of the invasion, since it had no ability or desire to interfere militarily. It protested Japan's actions in Manchuria by formulating the Stimson Doctrine, named after the Secretary of State Henry Stimson. Stimson also indicated that the U.S. continued to uphold the open door policy. The Stimson Doctrine had no effect on the Manchurian crisis. The U.S. government decided not to place any restrictions on its trade with Japan or Manchuria. The Soviet Union in late 1931 was in no condition to oppose any action by Japan in Manchuria. The world's only communist state was in the midst of social and economic upheaval with the collectivization of agriculture and its campaign to industrialize. For various reasons, including government inefficiency and ignorance, but also as a result of resistance, extreme weather, and lack of farming machinery, millions starved to death. The Soviet Union was too busy trying to stem the threat of outright revolt by its own starving people to intervene in Japan's invasion. The Soviet Union owned and operated the Chinese Eastern Railway in Manchuria, having lost the South Manchurian Railway. The Japanese informed the Soviets that they had no plans to interfere with the operation of the Chinese Eastern Railway. In 1935, the Soviet Union, clearly unable to defend the railway in case of Japanese aggression or nationalization, sold the railway to the state of Manchukuo in a transaction negotiated solely by Japan. Japan's government had been unaware of the Kuomintang Army's plan to conquer Manchuria, but knew that the army planned some further act of insubordination. The government replaced the overall commander just hours before the Mukden incident and therefore was unable to prevent its implementation. The government's main concern remained the army's disobedience. The army and government agreed that Manchuria should be dominated by Japan, but Japan did not wish to provoke the great powers. The government ordered the arrests of the perpetrators of the Mukden incident. The army refused, and the government collapsed over its inability to have the military obey. The next prime minister attempted to assert his authority over the military. He survived 2 attempted assassinations after he began negotiating with Chiang Kai-shek to resolve the crisis. But during the 15th of May incident, he was finally killed and replaced by a Navy admiral. Thus, the direct effect of the Mukden incident and the invasion of Manchuria was that the government policy was now aligned with military policy. This is a political cartoon done at the time, and it's really kind of mocking the U.S.'s open door policy. So there's the League of Nations, Notice that in political cartoons, anytime somebody's wearing a top hat, that means they're kind of in a place of privilege. So you notice like all of them are like white. They're all wearing top hats. They're, overprivileged, running the League of Nations. And then across from this U.S. kind of ran down. It's the Great Depression. His hair is kind of raggedy. He's not wearing a hat, so... And then, they're opening the door, and there inside that door is China and Japan fighting. And the League of Nations is kind of saying, well, there you go. U.S., go ahead. Why don't you fix this? And the U.S. is like, nope. And that's pretty much the description of this cartoon. The League of Nations was established at the Paris Peace Conference, and member states had pledged to defend each other in case of war. Many historians have claimed that the road to the Second World War began in 1931 at Mukden, and that profound weaknesses of the League were revealed. This initial failure, according to this argument, led to the Abyssinian crisis. While weaknesses were revealed, some historians state that the failure of the League of Nations to confront Japan actually demonstrated a new reality. This reality was that the great powers within the League of Nations, such as Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, would not oppose each other's dealings with smaller states. These historians go further and state that smaller, less powerful states realized that they were now more vulnerable and would be expected to give in to the demands of more powerful nations. Other historians claim that the Manchurian crisis actually strengthened the League by forcing it to set up committees and internal structures to deal with conflict between states, which had never been set up before because they had never been needed. A.G.B. Taylor makes this argument in The Origins of the Second World War and claims that historians only later gave significance, wrongly, to the Manchurian crisis. Debate about the significance of the Manchurian crisis continues today. Did the failure of collective security in the Manchurian crisis lead to the fall of the League? Did this crisis contribute to the origins of the Second World War? Was the League really prepared for another crisis between its member states? While these questions continue to be debated, it is important to understand that whatever the overall significance of the Manchurian crisis may have been, the League clearly failed to protect China from Japan. This moved Asia closer to war since Japan invaded the rest of China in 1937, but it is still unclear whether this also moved Europe closer to the Second World War. Establishing internal structures within the League to deal with any future aggression by member states was important, but addressing the lack of political willpower and financial ability of the great powers to intervene in conflicts was more complicated.